In the middle of a freezing morning, cars rush past, and there she stands. A little girl, no older than 7, holding her baby brother tight against the cold. Her voice trembles as she whispers to passing strangers. "Please, just $1. My brother needs medicine." But no one stops, not one, until a police officer sees her, and what happens next will remind you that kindness still exists, even in the coldest places, because sometimes the smallest act of courage can melt the hardest winter. Where are you watching from today? Drop your city in the comments, and may your day be filled with warmth, compassion, and a little bit of hope. The storm had not stopped for 3 days. Over the sleepy town of Maple Hollow, snow fell like crushed glass, blurring the edges of houses and swallowing the narrow road that led toward the northern ridge. Street lamps flickered beneath the wind's howl, painting golden streaks through the white chaos. It was mid-January in Wyoming, where winter didn't just arrive, it conquered. Officer Ethan Cole guided his patrol SUV through the storm, wipers fighting to keep up with the thick flakes hammering the windshield. The heater hummed weakly. Beside him sat Ranger, his German shepherd, 5 years old, trained in rescue and search. Ranger was a magnificent creature, broad chest, sable coat streaked with silver, amber eyes always alert. There was an intelligence in those eyes that often startled strangers, as if the dog understood every human emotion, but chose silence out of respect. His ears twitched each time the snow cracked beneath the tires. Ethan glanced at his partner. "We've seen worse, huh, boy?" he murmured. Ranger's tail thumped softly against the seat, a quiet rhythm of loyalty. The dog had been his companion since the academy, through raids, rescues, and the long, lonely nights that followed his wife's death. For Ethan, Ranger was more than a K-9 unit. He was the last thread tying him to something human. Ethan himself was 34, tall, solidly built, with that stillness often found in people who've known both danger and loss. His hair was dark brown, trimmed short at the sides, though a stubborn wave fell across his forehead when wet. A thin scar traced his jawline, a souvenir from a case gone wrong years ago. But what marked him most wasn't visible. It was the quiet grief in his gray eyes. 2 winters earlier, he had lost his wife, Lauren, and their 2-year-old son in a house fire caused by a faulty heater while he was on duty. The guilt gnawed at him like frostbite. Since then, he buried himself in work and patrols, where pain at least had a name and purpose. Maple Hollow itself was a town that looked like it belonged to another century. Rows of wooden cabins pressed close against the pine forests, smoke curling lazily from stone chimneys. People here nodded in passing, but didn't linger to talk. Winters made everyone private. The only sound tonight was the wind, or so Ethan thought, until Ranger's head suddenly jerked toward the windshield. A low growl vibrated in his throat. "What is it?" Ethan slowed the SUV, eyes sweeping the road ahead. Through the blur of snow, a small shape flickered between the beams of his headlights, something moving, stumbling. He braked instinctively, the vehicle sliding slightly before stopping. The radio crackled with static, but he ignored it. The figure reappeared, closer now. A child, barely taller than the hood of the car. She wore a puffy pink coat too small for her frame, its zipper broken halfway, exposing a torn sweater beneath. Her boots were soaked, her hat lopsided, and in her arms she carried something bundled in a thin blanket. Ranger barked once, sharp and urgent. Ethan's pulse spiked. He opened the door, cold slicing through him like knives. "Hey, are you okay?" he called, trudging through knee-deep snow. The girl stopped, blinking through flakes that clung to her lashes. She couldn't have been older than 7. Freckles dusted her pale cheeks, and her lips were cracked from cold. She held up a small box of candy bars with trembling hands. "Please, sir, $1 each," she said, her voice breaking like ice. "My baby brother's real sick." Ethan froze for a beat, the words cutting deeper than the cold. Behind her, cars crawled by, headlights ghostly in the storm, none stopping. "Where are your parents?" he asked, crouching slightly to meet her eyes. "My mom's sick too," she whispered. "She can't get up. We're in the shed behind the tire shop." Ranger whined, circling closer, sniffing the air near the baby. The blanket shifted, revealing a round, pale face, too still. The child's lips were tinted blue, breath shallow and uneven. Ethan's instincts snapped into motion. He took off his gloves and checked the baby's pulse, weak but there. "He needs a hospital," he said firmly. The girl shook her head, stepping back. "We can't. We don't got money." "I'm a police officer," Ethan said, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to pay anything. Let me help." She looked up then, eyes wide and green-gray, the color of storm clouds, eyes that had seen too much for her age. After a long hesitation, she nodded. Ethan took the baby carefully, feeling the fragile warmth through the thin blanket, and guided the girl toward his SUV. Ranger trotted beside them, his body a moving wall of protection. Inside, heat began to fill the air. The girl sat in the back seat clutching Ranger's fur, as if anchoring herself to something solid. The dog, sensing her fear, rested his head gently on her lap. Ethan adjusted the temperature and turned to look at her through the rearview mirror. "What's your name?" he asked. "Ellie," she murmured. "Ellie Carter, and this is Tommy." "Ellie, I'm Officer Cole," he said softly. "We're gonna get Tommy help." She nodded, holding the baby tighter. "He's been coughing since yesterday. Mom said it's just a cold, but he couldn't breathe right." Ethan's gaze flicked to Tommy. The baby's chest rose in short, irregular spasms. A faint rattle escaped his throat, a sound Ethan would never forget. He'd heard it once before, years ago, when his own son had pneumonia. That memory hit like a fist. For a moment, he had to steady himself, gripping the steering wheel hard. He pressed the radio button. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4. I've got 2 minors in need of immediate medical assistance. Infant male, respiratory distress. ETA 15 minutes to County Hospital." The static hummed back. "Copy that, Unit 4." As he pulled onto the road, the siren's distant wail sliced through the snow. Ellie jumped at the sound, then relaxed when Ranger nudged her hand again. Ethan glanced back. "He's friendly," he said. "You can pet him." She gave a faint smile and began stroking the thick fur between Ranger's ears. "He's warm," she whispered. "Like a fireplace." Ethan watched in the mirror, something tightening in his chest. It wasn't pity. It was something deeper. Recognition. He saw in Ellie's small, determined face the same stubborn will that once kept him going through nights when he couldn't sleep. Traffic thinned as they neared the highway. Snow lashed against the glass in furious bursts. Through the haze, Maple Hollow's flickering lights disappeared behind them, swallowed by darkness. Ethan kept one hand steady on the wheel, the other occasionally checking the mirror. Tommy's breathing grew shallower. "Hang in there, little guy," he muttered. Ellie looked up. "You got kids, Officer Cole?" He hesitated. The question landed like a stone. "I used to," he said quietly. "A boy about your brother's age." "What happened?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "He got sick too, but I couldn't get to him in time." The car went silent except for the hum of the heater. Then Ellie said, very softly, "Then you know how to help." The simplicity of her faith undid him. He blinked hard, focusing on the road. Snow was falling thicker now, and visibility dropped to almost nothing. He turned on the siren again, a red-blue halo pulsing through the storm. At the next intersection, a pickup truck slid across the ice, blocking his path. Ethan braked hard, heart pounding. Ranger barked, alert. The driver of the pickup, a bearded man in a heavy jacket, jumped out, shouting over the wind. "Road's closed. Tree fell near the bridge." "Hospital's this way," Ethan called back. "Then you'll need to go through Cedar Bend. It's longer, but clear." Ethan nodded, thanked the man, and turned the SUV around. Ellie was watching him, eyes wide. "Are we going to make it?" He forced a smile. "We're going to make it." Ranger gave a short bark, as if agreeing. The detour cut through back roads lined with frozen pines. Snow whirled in sheets across the hood, but the SUV pressed on. 10 minutes later, city lights appeared faintly ahead. The glow of the county hospital. Ethan exhaled in relief, just as a small sound reached him. A weak cough followed by silence. "Ellie," he said quickly. She shook Tommy gently. "He's not breathing right." Ethan's training took over. He pulled to the curb, yanked open the back door, and checked the baby's airway. A shallow gasp escaped Tommy's lips. Ethan began chest compressions with precise rhythm, murmuring under his breath. Ellie sobbed, clutching Ranger's fur. The dog whined softly, pressing against her as if to steady both of them. Then, after what felt like forever, Tommy wheezed, a fragile, shuddering breath. Ethan's shoulders sagged. He lifted the baby into his arms and ran toward the ER entrance, boots pounding on the icy pavement. The automatic doors slid open in a rush of warm air and bright light. "Nurse! Infant! Severe distress!" he shouted. Two nurses rushed forward with a gurney. Ellie stumbled after him, tears frozen to her cheeks. Ranger stopped at the door, waiting, his body trembling with anticipation. As doctors took the baby, Ethan turned to Ellie and knelt down. "You did good, kid. You found me. That saved him." She looked up through her tears, voice shaking. "You promise he'll be okay?" He hesitated, then said softly, "He's got a fighting chance now." Behind them, Ranger pressed his nose gently against Ellie's hand. She leaned into him, eyes closing. For the first time in days, she wasn't standing alone in the snow. Outside, the storm began to ease. The flakes slowed, drifting lazily beneath the hospital lights. And for the first time that winter, Ethan felt something unfamiliar rise in his chest, not the ache of loss, but the first fragile stirring of hope. The hospital in Maple Hollow was small, a single-story building perched at the edge of town, its windows fogged with frost and the parking lot buried beneath slush. Inside, it smelled of disinfectant and stale coffee. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting an almost metallic glow on the linoleum floors. Officer Ethan Cole stood at the admitting desk, snow still clinging to his boots, while behind him, Ellie Carter sat on a vinyl bench holding Ranger's leash with both hands. The dog sat loyally beside her, tail still, eyes fixed on the corridor where nurses had carried her baby brother minutes ago. She looked so small there, swallowed by the oversized coat Ethan had wrapped around her shoulders. A nurse named Marianne Dorsey approached, her face softened by years of tending to worry and pain. She was in her mid-40s, broad-shouldered, with auburn hair streaked by gray, and a voice that carried quiet authority. "He's in good hands now, officer," she said, her tone both brisk and kind. "Pediatric team is working on stabilizing him. Severe respiratory infection, but they think they caught it in time." Ethan exhaled. "Thank God." Marianne nodded once, eyes flicking to Ellie. "Is she family?" He hesitated. "No. Found her out in the storm. Her mother's ill somewhere nearby." Marianne frowned slightly. "We'll need her mother's information when we can. Poor thing looks half frozen." Ethan crouched beside Ellie. "They're helping Tommy now, okay? He's going to be all right." She nodded, though her eyes never left the hallway. Ranger shifted, resting his muzzle gently on her knee. Marianne returned with a cup of cocoa and handed it to Ellie. "Drink up, sweetheart." The girl murmured a thank you so soft it almost vanished. When Ethan straightened, another figure stepped into the waiting area, Dr. Henry Jacobs, the attending physician on duty. Henry was in his early 50s, thin as a fence post, with kind blue eyes behind wire-frame glasses and a perpetual air of fatigue. His hands, though roughened by years in the ER, moved with calm precision. He spoke in clipped sentences, as if every word had to fit between the beeps of a monitor. "You're the officer who brought them in?" he asked. Ethan nodded. "Good work. The boy was hypothermic, lungs full of fluid. We've got him on antibiotics and oxygen. The next 24 hours are critical." Ethan looked past him down the hallway. "Can I see him?" "Soon," Henry said, adjusting his glasses. "He's sleeping now. You can wait with the girl." Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "If you hadn't found them when you did, we'd be having a different conversation." Ethan sat beside Ellie, hands clasped, watching the snow swirl outside through the window. The storm was easing, but he couldn't shake the image of her out there in the road, clutching her brother, begging strangers for $1. It felt obscene that something like that could happen right under everyone's noses. He'd seen neglect before, sure, but not like this. This was desperation wrapped in innocence. Ranger nudged his leg softly. The dog had settled at his feet, still alert, but calm. Ethan reached down, scratching the space behind Ranger's ear. "You did good tonight, partner." Ranger's amber eyes flickered up, solemn, as if understanding. Ellie sipped her cocoa, hands trembling around the paper cup. "Officer Cole," she said after a long silence, "you think my mom's okay?" Ethan met her gaze. "We'll go find her soon, I promise." "She gets dizzy sometimes," Ellie continued, staring at her boots. "Says it's from not eating much, but she always gives food to Tommy first." Ethan swallowed. "You've been taking care of both of them, haven't you?" She nodded once. "Since before Christmas." Marianne returned with a blanket and draped it over Ellie's shoulders. "Why don't you rest for a bit, honey?" Ellie shook her head. "I want to stay awake till Tommy wakes up." The firmness in her voice startled both adults. Ethan smiled faintly. "Stubborn one, huh?" Marianne chuckled. "The strong ones always are." Hours passed. The hospital quieted as the night deepened, the sound of distant monitors and the hum of the heater the only constants. Ethan had called dispatch earlier, reported the situation, and requested an officer check the shed behind Jensen's tire shop where Ellie said her mother was. Now he waited for word, sipping black coffee from a vending machine. Near midnight, the door swung open and a younger officer stepped inside, shaking snow from his jacket. Officer Mark Rivera, early 30s, clean-shaven, with olive skin and eyes that missed little. He was new to Maple Hollow, transferred from Denver after a case went bad. The kind of man who laughed too easily to hide how much he'd seen. "Cole," he greeted, voice low. "We found the place. Looks like someone's been living there. Blankets, empty cans, but no one home." Ethan frowned. "You sure?" Rivera nodded. "We'll keep looking. Maybe she wandered off for help." He glanced toward Ellie and lowered his voice. "Poor kid." Ethan rubbed a hand over his face. "Thanks, Mark. Keep me posted." When Rivera left, Ethan returned to Ellie. "They're out looking for your mom, okay?" She didn't answer. Ranger had moved closer, his head now resting in her lap. Her small fingers absently brushed through his fur. Ethan watched, realizing how naturally Ranger had attached himself to her, as if the dog sensed something fragile worth protecting. Around 2 a.m., Dr. Jacobs emerged again. "The boy's stable," he said, still critical, but breathing on his own. Ethan felt the tension drain from his shoulders. Ellie's head snapped up. "Can I see him?" "Just for a minute," Jacobs replied, gesturing. "Quietly." Ethan followed her into the small observation room. Machines beeped softly beside the crib-sized bed, where Tommy lay under a warm blanket. Oxygen mask covering his tiny face. His cheeks had regained a faint flush of color. Ellie climbed onto the chair, eyes wide. "He looks better," she whispered. Ethan nodded, standing behind her. For the first time that night, something inside him eased. Marianne entered quietly, carrying a clipboard. "We'll need some details for the record," she said gently. "Your full name, Ellie?" "Ellie Carter." "And your mother's?" "Rachel Carter," she replied. "She's 32. "Do you have any other family nearby?" Ellie shook her head. "No, ma'am. It's just us." Marianne jotted notes, then glanced at Ethan. "We'll contact social services in the morning, but for tonight she stays here." Ethan stayed too. He sat by the window, watching dawn creep pale and fragile over the snow. The storm had finally broken, leaving the world washed clean, but hollow. Ranger dozed beside Ellie's chair, paws twitching in dream. She had fallen asleep leaning against him, the dog's fur like a blanket around her shoulders. Ethan couldn't look away from them. Something about that image, the girl, the child, the dog, hit him deeper than anything had in years. It stirred memories he thought he'd buried, his son's toy car on the windowsill, the small hand that used to clutch his sleeve, the night he came home too late. He whispered under his breath, "Not this time." As the first rays of sun broke through the hospital window, his radio buzzed. Rivera's voice crackled through. "Cole, we found the mother." Ethan stood instantly. "Where?" "About a mile east of Jensen's shop, down by the creek. She's alive but weak. EMS is bringing her in now." Ethan turned to Marianne. "Get a room ready." She nodded, already moving. Ellie stirred at the noise, rubbing her eyes. "What's happening?" "They found your mom," Ethan said softly. The girl blinked as if unsure whether she'd heard right. Then, when he nodded again, she burst into tears, not loud, but trembling sobs that shook her shoulders. Ranger pressed against her side, licking her cheek once before resting his head again. Ethan placed a hand on her back. "She's coming here. You did it, Ellie. You got her help." Outside, the morning sun climbed higher, melting the icicles from the eaves. Snow still blanketed the town, but Maple Hollow no longer looked lifeless. Inside that small hospital room, something fragile but undeniable had begun to thaw, the first warmth of a family slowly stitching itself back together. The ambulance's siren cut through the dawn, echoing across the empty fields as it rolled into Maple Hollow Hospital. Ethan stood near the entrance with Ellie still clutching Ranger's leash. The girl's eyes were wide, her face pale but hopeful. The automatic doors slid open with a hiss as paramedics pushed in a stretcher. On it lay a woman, thin, ghostly, her hair matted and dark from melted snow, her lips faintly blue. Oxygen tubes traced along her cheeks. Ethan's chest tightened. Even unconscious, Rachel Carter looked younger than he expected, perhaps 32, but worn in the way that suffering leaves its fingerprints. Her face was delicate, high cheekboned beneath hollow eyes, and her hands, calloused and cracked, rested limply at her sides. Ellie gasped. "Mom!" She tried to run forward, but Ethan caught her shoulders gently. "Let them help her first." The nurse in charge, Mary Ann, met his eyes. "We'll take her to observation. Hypothermia, dehydration, severe pneumonia. She's lucky she lasted the night." Then, softer, she added, "And lucky someone found her." Ethan watched as Rachel disappeared through the swinging doors, her stretcher swallowed by white hallways. Ranger gave a low whine, tail flicking once before he sat beside Ellie again. The little girl clung to the dog, burying her face in his thick fur. Ethan crouched down beside her. "She's in good hands, Ellie. They'll make her warm again." She nodded against Ranger's coat, but didn't look up. By mid-morning, the snow had stopped. Pale sunlight spilled weakly through the hospital windows. Ethan hadn't left. He sat in the small waiting area by the vending machines, coffee long gone cold in his hands. Ranger lay at his feet, half asleep, his chest rising and falling with a slow, steady rhythm. Across the room, Ellie had dozed off on a bench, wrapped in a blanket Mary Ann had found for her. The child's small hand remained tangled in Ranger's fur, even as she slept. Ethan's radio crackled, breaking the quiet. "Unit 4, this is dispatch. You there, Cole?" He lifted the mic. "Go ahead. Sergeant Hale wants a report on your overnight call. Says you missed briefing." Ethan grimaced. "Copy that. Tell him I'll file it later today." A pause. Then a voice replied, "He doesn't sound happy." Of course he didn't. Sergeant Rick Hale was a by-the-book officer in his late 40s, square-jawed, graying at the temples, and perpetually wound tight. He was fair, but the kind of man who believed duty came before sentiment. Ethan could already imagine the conversation. "You abandoned your route to play guardian angel? That's not protocol, Cole." But Ethan didn't care. He looked toward Ellie, and the thought struck him. If his own son had been out there last night, he would have prayed for someone to do the same. When Ellie woke, the first thing she asked was, "Can I see her?" Ethan nodded. Mary Ann led them through the hallway, her voice low. "She's still very weak. Keep it calm." Inside the room, Rachel lay propped against a pillow, a tangle of wires and tubes surrounding her. Her breathing was shallow but steady. When her eyes fluttered open, they were the same gray-green as Ellie's. For a moment she looked lost, confused by the brightness of the room, by the machines. But then her gaze fell on her daughter, and something fragile yet fierce lit her face. "Ellie," she rasped. The word cracked halfway through. Ellie rushed to her bedside. "Mom, I got help. The policeman and Ranger, they found us." Rachel's hand trembled as she lifted it to her daughter's cheek. You did good, baby." Her gaze shifted toward Ethan then, studying him through the fog of exhaustion. "You're the one who found them?" He nodded. "Name's Ethan Cole, officer with Maple Hollow PD." She gave a faint, tired smile. "Thank you. I couldn't get up anymore." Her voice carried the weight of apology, of shame. Ethan shook his head. "You don't need to explain." But she did anyway. "We moved here a few months ago. I thought there'd be work at the mill. Then I got sick. Lost the job before it started. Her words came slow, broken by coughs. Couldn't pay rent. Landlord threw us out before Christmas. Been trying to keep them fed since. Ethan felt the sting of it like a slap. The world had a way of punishing those who already had nothing. You did what you could, he said quietly. That's what matters. At that moment, Dr. Jacobs entered, clipboard in hand. You're awake. That's a good sign, he said, tone brisk but kind. We'll keep you here a few days, Ms. Carter. Antibiotics, fluids, rest, no arguments. Rachel nodded faintly, sinking back against her pillow. When they stepped out of the room, Jacobs turned to Ethan. She'll make it, but she's weak. Malnutrition, stress, exposure. It's a miracle the kids are even alive. Ethan exhaled. They'll need somewhere to stay after this. Jacobs gave him a pointed look. You planning to take them in, officer? Ethan didn't answer immediately. If I have to. Outside, the storm clouds had broken apart, revealing the jagged peaks of the distant mountains. The air was so clear, it hurt to breathe. Ethan stepped out to the hospital's front steps for a moment of air. Ranger followed, shaking the stiffness from his limbs before sitting neatly beside him. The dog tilted his head, ears perked toward Ethan's silence. What do you think, boy? Ethan murmured. We're in deep now, huh? Ranger gave a single low bark, tail brushing the snow. It almost felt like an answer. Back inside, Sergeant Hale was waiting in the lobby. He was a broad man, his uniform perfectly pressed, his eyes hard as marbles. Cole, he said, voice clipped, heard you turned your patrol into a rescue. I had mission. Ethan straightened. That's right, sir. 2 minors and a woman in distress. I did what was necessary. Hale crossed his arms. And left your assigned zone unattended for 5 hours. Ethan met his gaze evenly. If I hadn't, the baby would be dead. A muscle twitched in Hale's jaw. For a long moment, the 2 men stood in quiet tension. Then Hale sighed, glancing toward Ellie down the hall. You've always had a hero complex, Cole. Just make sure it doesn't get you suspended. When Hale left, Ethan leaned against the wall, fatigue washing over him. Ranger brushed against his leg, grounding him again. He looked toward the pediatric wing, toward the life he'd accidentally stumbled into. That afternoon, while Rachel slept, Ellie sat on the floor of the hospital hallway with a coloring book someone from the staff had found. Ranger lay beside her, head resting between his paws. He likes the color green, she whispered conspiratorially to Ethan, who was sitting nearby writing his report. He smiled faintly. Green, huh? Didn't know dogs had favorite colors. Ellie nodded with all the seriousness of childhood. He told me. Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. Later, Marianne brought Ethan a form from social services. They'll need a temporary guardian if Rachel can't care for them yet. She hesitated. They asked if you'd consider it. Ethan stared at the paper, the weight of it heavy in his hands. I'm not exactly equipped for that. Maybe not, Marianne said gently. But sometimes the right person isn't the one who's ready. It's the one who shows up. Evening fell. The hospital lights glowed warm against the gathering dusk. Rachel's condition improved slowly. The doctors said another day or 2, and she'd be stable. Ellie had fallen asleep in a chair again, Ranger curled protectively at her feet. Ethan sat nearby, writing the last lines of his report, though his mind was elsewhere. He looked at the small family, broken but surviving, and felt something shift within him. It was subtle, like the first crack of thawing ice. For years he'd lived inside a winter that never ended. But now, watching Ellie's fingers curl around Ranger's paw, watching Rachel's steady breathing from across the hall, he realized the snow was finally melting. By the end of the week, the snow began to melt around Maple Hollow, forming silver pools along the curbs and leaving the air smelling faintly of pine and wet earth. The hospital had discharged Rachel Carter that morning, her lungs still weak but stable. She moved carefully, wrapped in a faded blue coat someone from the church had donated. Her cheeks, though pale, held the first sign of color since the storm. Ethan Cole waited by the entrance with Ellie, holding Ranger's leash, and the baby, Tommy, bundled snugly in her arms. "Ready?" he asked. Rachel nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. More than ready. Her gratitude had been quiet these past few days, not out of pride, but exhaustion. She was the kind of woman who apologized even when she didn't need to, the kind who'd known too many people who walked away. Ethan didn't press her with questions. He simply led her to his truck, opening the passenger door as Ranger jumped gracefully into the back. Ellie giggled softly. "He always sits in the same spot," she said. "That's his seat now," Ethan replied, officially claimed. As they drove through town, Maple Hollow looked almost peaceful again. Smoke curled from chimneys, children's laughter echoed faintly from behind windows. It was the kind of town that could seem kind from a distance and cold up close. Ethan knew that better than anyone. He turned off the main road toward the lake, where a small cabin waited. The place wasn't much, a single-story house with cedar walls and a slanted roof that looked perpetually dusted with snow. It had belonged to Ethan's late father, a retired forest ranger who'd built it with his own hands. After his death, Ethan had rarely visited. Now, it seemed like the only place that felt right. When they arrived, Ranger leapt out first, bounding toward the porch and sniffing the frozen air like a sentinel reclaiming his post. Ellie followed, her boots crunching against the snow, eyes wide as she looked around. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "It's quiet," Rachel murmured, stepping out carefully. "Too quiet." Ethan smiled faintly. "You'll get used to it. The lake's right behind the house. When it thaws, it's nice for walks." Inside, the cabin was simple but warm. The living room opened into a small kitchen, with a fireplace built from river stone and shelves lined with old photographs of mountains and hiking trails. A faint scent of cedar lingered in the air. "It's not fancy," Ethan said, setting down their few belongings. "But it's safe." Ellie turned in a slow circle, eyes bright. "Safe is good." Ranger padded over to the hearth and flopped down, tail thudding softly. Tommy, curious, stretched a tiny hand toward the dog. Ranger sniffed gently before resting his head beside the baby's foot. Ellie laughed. "He likes us already." While Rachel settled Tommy on the couch, Ethan lit the fireplace. Sparks flickered to life, throwing amber light across the room. "You can stay here until you're back on your feet," he said quietly. Rachel looked at him, her expression uncertain. "You've done enough, Officer Cole. We'll find somewhere soon." He shook his head. "It's Ethan, and there's no rush. You don't have anywhere to be right now, except warm." A silence hung between them, broken only by the crackle of fire. Then Rachel said, "You remind me of someone." Ethan looked up. "Your husband?" She shook her head. "My brother. He was in the service, always trying to fix everything, even when it wasn't his job." She smiled faintly, though her eyes darkened at the memory. "He didn't make it back." Ethan nodded slowly, understanding the language of loss without words. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," she said softly. "He'd be happy to know there are still people like you out there." As the day stretched on, Ethan made soup in the small kitchen. He wasn't a skilled cook, but he knew the basics: chicken broth, potatoes, carrots, salt. Ellie helped by handing him spoons and narrating every step as if it were a grand operation. "You're good at this," she said earnestly. "Better than Mom." Rachel laughed weakly from the couch. "That's not hard, sweetheart." When evening came, Ranger lifted his head suddenly, ears perked. A knock echoed through the cabin. Ethan glanced toward the door. Standing outside was Martha Green, a neighbor who lived half a mile down the road. Martha was in her 60s, tall and sturdy, with silver hair tied in a loose braid and eyes the color of blue glass. She wore a thick wool coat and carried a basket of food. "Heard you were back, Ethan," she said, stepping inside with practiced ease. "And you've got company." Rachel tried to stand, but Martha waved her off. "Sit down, dear. You look like you fought a blizzard and won." She set the basket on the counter, bread, apples, a jar of honey. "Consider it a welcome-back offering, or pity for your empty pantry." Her humor was gentle but sharp enough to make Ethan chuckle. "Thanks, Martha." Martha had known Ethan since he was a boy. She'd been close friends with his mother, and after the accident that took his family, she had been one of the few who checked in, never prying, just present. She now turned her sharp gaze toward Rachel and Ellie, reading the story in their weary faces without asking a thing. "You've got good hearts," she said finally. "Don't let this town's gossip make you forget that." Then she glanced at Ethan. "And you, Cole. Remember, helping folks doesn't mean you have to carry all their weight. After she left, the cabin fell quiet again. Outside, twilight deepened into blue. Rachel leaned back against the couch, eyes closing. Your neighbor's kind. She's honest, Ethan said. That's rarer. As night fell, the family of sorts settled into a rhythm. Ellie curled on the rug beside Ranger, tracing shapes in his fur. Tommy slept peacefully in the bassinet Marianne had arranged for them to borrow. Rachel watched from the couch, a tired but genuine smile on her lips. I don't remember the last time it was this quiet, she whispered. No cold, no hunger, just quiet. Ethan sat across the room, the fire's glow painting gold into his gray eyes. Quiet's not always bad, he said. Sometimes it's the sound of things starting over. Before turning in, Ethan stepped outside for air. The moon hung low over the lake, its reflection rippling through the ice. Ranger followed, standing beside him, breath steaming in the cold. We've got guests now, Ethan murmured, rubbing the dog's neck. Hope you don't mind. Ranger gave a soft huff, his ears twitching toward the cabin, where laughter, small and fragile, still drifted through the walls. Inside, Rachel watched through the window. For the first time in months, she didn't feel invisible. The sight of Ethan standing beneath the moonlight, the loyal dog beside him, and her daughter safe in a warm room, it all felt impossible, like a scene borrowed from a dream. She whispered to herself, maybe some storms do end. That night, as wind moved gently through the pines, the cabin by the lake glowed like a lantern in the snow, a small, stubborn flame against the dark. And within its light, 3 souls and 1 faithful dog began to remember what home felt like. Morning crept slowly over Maple Hollow, turning the lake outside Ethan's cabin into a mirror of soft gold. Mist drifted low across the frozen water, and somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker tapped faintly on pine. Inside, warmth hummed from the fireplace, the scent of coffee mingling with wood smoke. Ethan stood by the counter, pouring oatmeal into bowls while Ellie helped, her hair tangled from sleep and her eyes bright with purpose. Ranger sat nearby, tail sweeping the floor each time she passed him. Rachel appeared at the doorway, her steps tentative but stronger than before. She wore one of Ethan's flannel shirts over her thin sweater, sleeves rolled up to her elbows. Color had returned to her cheeks, though her eyes still carried the faint hollowness of recovery. You're up early, she said, voice softer than the morning light. Habit, Ethan replied, handing her a mug of coffee. Police life. You learn to beat the sun. She smiled faintly. Thank you, for the shirt, and for everything. Ellie interrupted, holding up 2 unevenly filled bowls. Mom, I helped. Rachel's smile widened, pride and weariness mingling in her face. You did perfect, honey. Ethan watched the exchange quietly. He'd seen hundreds of families in his line of work, broken, frightened, angry, but rarely this kind of gentleness, fragile and genuine. After breakfast, Ethan bundled up to leave for a short shift. I'll be gone a few hours. Mark's covering the rest. Rachel nodded. We'll be fine. Ellie tugged on his sleeve. Can we go outside later? As long as you take Ranger, he said. The dog perked up at his name, ears alert. Ellie grinned. Deal! At the precinct, the world of warmth vanished behind the glass doors. Sergeant Hale's office loomed at the end of the hall, blinds half drawn. The rest of the department was a hum of radios and typing, a contrast to the hush of the cabin. Ethan found Officer Mark Rivera by the coffee machine, his dark hair mussed and jacket half unzipped. Mark was the kind of man who found humor in storms. Heard your guests are settling in, he said. The whole town's talking. Ethan frowned. About what? About how Cole, the steel officer of Maple Hollow, took in a stray family. Mark grinned, sipping his coffee. They say you've gone soft. Ethan's jaw tightened, but his eyes softened slightly. Maybe softness isn't a bad thing. Mark nodded. Maybe not, but watch your back. Hale's not thrilled. Moments later, Hale summoned him. The sergeant stood by his desk, uniform crisp, expression unreadable. Cole, he began, voice even. I got your report. It was thorough, as always. But housing civilians, especially minors, without proper clearance, that's a liability. Ethan stayed calm. They had nowhere to go. I wasn't about to send them back into the snow. Hale sighed, rubbing his temples. You're a good cop, Ethan, one of the best. But good cops don't break chain of command. There was silence before Hale added, almost reluctantly, still, given the circumstances, I'm authorizing temporary guardianship paperwork. Social services will follow up. Ethan exhaled, tension easing. Thank you. Hale's gaze softened for a moment. Don't thank me yet. If this blows up, it's on you. When he returned home that afternoon, the air around the lake had changed. Children's laughter drifted faintly, and as he stepped inside, he saw Ellie and Ranger playing near the hearth, both covered in streaks of flour. We made cookies, she shouted proudly. Rachel looked up from the counter, amusement tugging at her lips. Correction, she made a mess. Ethan chuckled, setting his hat on the rack. That's what childhood's for. Ranger, his fur dusted white, wagged his tail and trotted to Ethan, carrying a wooden spoon as if it were a prize. Traitor, Ethan muttered, taking it back. The moment felt almost domestic, dangerously so. Later, as dusk settled, the cabin filled with the smell of baking and the soft crackle of fire. Ethan repaired a loose window latch while Rachel folded laundry nearby. You really built this place? She asked. My father did, he said. I just keep it from falling apart. Rachel hesitated, folding one of Ellie's small sweaters. He must have been a good man. Ethan nodded slowly. He was, hard on the outside, quiet on the inside. He used to say the forest teaches patience. You can't fight a storm. You wait it out. Rachel smiled faintly. That's a good way to live. Then, almost shyly, she added, Ellie likes you. She's not usually like that with strangers. I'm not a stranger anymore, he said quietly. Outside, the wind picked up. The lake's surface, half thawed, shimmered like glass under the moonlight. Ellie ran to the window. It's so shiny, she exclaimed. Can we go see it? Rachel started to say no, but Ethan shook his head. Bundle up, just for a few minutes. They stepped out together. Ethan, Rachel, Ellie, Ranger, trotting ahead with the confidence of a guardian. The lake reflected the night sky, stars scattered like diamonds. Ellie threw a pebble, watching the ripples expand. It looks like the world's breathing, she said. Ethan smiled. Maybe it is. Rachel stood beside him, the wind teasing loose strands of her dark hair. When I was little, she said softly, my mother used to take us to a lake like this. She said water remembers kindness. Every stone you throw, every good thing you do, it ripples back someday. Ethan looked at her, then at Ellie skipping along the shore. I think she was right. Back inside, Ellie fell asleep curled against Ranger, one hand resting on his neck. The dog didn't move, eyes half-lidded but watchful. Rachel tucked a blanket around her daughter and lingered beside the fire. You've given us more than shelter, she said quietly. You gave Ellie her laughter back. Ethan looked at her, voice low. She gave me something too. Reminded me that quiet isn't the same as empty. The moment hung between them, fragile and unspoken. Then Ranger stirred suddenly, ears twitching toward the door. A distant crunch of snow broke the stillness. Footsteps outside. Ethan's instincts returned in a heartbeat. He rose, motioning Rachel to stay quiet. He unholstered his sidearm and moved to the window. A figure approached, bundled in a heavy coat. The porch light caught his face. It was Mark Rivera. Ethan opened the door, tension fading. You scared the hell out of me. Mark grinned sheepishly, brushing snow off his shoulders. Sorry, didn't mean to spook your watchdog. I came by to drop this. He held out an envelope. Official paperwork from Hale. Temporary custody approved. You're legal now, father of 2. Rachel looked up in surprise. Is that real? Ethan nodded, smiling. Yeah, guess it is. Mark lingered for a few minutes, meeting Rachel properly this time. Ma'am, you've got a brave little girl there, he said warmly. He was a man of easy humor, but his eyes revealed sincerity. Not many kids could have done what Ellie did. Rachel's voice softened. She got that from her brother, she said, glancing toward the sleeping baby. He never gives up either. After Mark left, quiet returned. But it was a different kind of quiet, peaceful, earned. Ethan placed the envelope on the mantel. Ranger followed him, sitting at his feet. head tilted in that wise, patient way. "Looks like it's official," Ethan said. "Guess we're a team now." Rachel, half smiling, replied, "You always were." Outside, snow began again, soft, harmless flakes dancing over the lake. The world, for once, didn't feel heavy. It felt like beginning. 2 weeks passed quietly in Maple Hollow. The lake had begun to thaw, strips of silver water cutting through the white crust of ice. The Carter children were healthy again, and laughter had returned to the cabin. Ellie's high, musical giggles mingling with Tommy's baby babble, and the steady rhythm of Ranger's tail thumping on the floorboards. Ethan had never imagined his home filled with such noise. It both unsettled and comforted him. Rachel, still regaining her strength, had taken to sitting near the window during the day, sewing small pieces of fabric into a quilt. Her movements were slow but graceful, and her dark hair caught the afternoon light like silk. Each stitch seemed to steady her heart a little more. But peace in Maple Hollow was a fragile thing. That morning, Ethan received a call from dispatch as he poured his coffee. A break-in at the old lumber yard on the east side, tools stolen, tracks leading toward the forest. Nothing urgent, but in a small town, even a rumor of trouble stirred unease. He looked toward Rachel, who was feeding Tommy, and Ellie tracing pictures in the frost on the window pane. "I'll be gone for a bit," he said. "Mark's meeting me at the yard." Rachel glanced up, concern flickering in her gray-green eyes. "Be careful, Ethan." "Always," he replied with a small smile. Ranger stood immediately, sensing work. The lumber yard sat on the edge of town, near the pines that rolled endlessly north. When Ethan arrived, Mark Rivera was already there, crouched beside the tire tracks half buried in slush. He wore his standard uniform jacket open despite the cold, his breath visible in the air. "Looks like 2 sets of footprints," Mark said, rising. "Could be kids, could be drifters." Ethan studied the tracks. "Heading toward the tree line." Mark shrugged. "They can't get far, half the forest's still frozen." They followed the trail into the pines, Ranger leading with his nose low to the ground. The dog's posture was focused, alert. Ears pricked, tail level, muscles taut beneath his sable coat. "He's on to something," Ethan muttered. A few hundred yards in, they found the remains of a small fire pit, still smoldering. Beside it, a torn blanket and an empty can of beans. Mark bent down, examining the ashes. "Someone's living out here." Ethan frowned. "In this cold?" Then, a rustle. Ranger barked sharply, bounding toward the sound. A figure bolted from behind a fallen log. A man, thin and unshaven, stumbling through the snow. Ethan chased him down, tackling him to the ground. The man twisted, eyes wild with panic. He was in his mid-30s, his clothes filthy and hands trembling. "Please!" he gasped. "I didn't mean nothing. Just needed food." His voice cracked with desperation. Ethan cuffed him gently. "Name?" "Calvin," he rasped. "Calvin Moore." Mark recognized him immediately. He used to work at Jensen's Tire before. It closed, laid off 2 months back. Ethan's expression softened slightly. Calvin's face was gaunt, his beard uneven, but his eyes, tired and glassy blue, held no malice, just hunger. "You could have asked for help," Ethan said quietly. "Town doesn't care about people like me," Calvin muttered. "They look right through you." Ethan sighed. "You're coming with us, but you'll get a hot meal first." Back at the station, Calvin sat in the holding room, wrapped in a blanket, sipping coffee like it was gold. Ethan stood at the door watching him, a strange heaviness settling in his chest. He saw pieces of himself in the man, the isolation, the quiet resignation. When Mark returned from filing paperwork, he said, "You know Hale's going to want to charge him. Breaking and entering, theft, simple case." Ethan nodded. "We'll see." Later that evening, when Ethan returned home, the world felt gentler again. Ellie met him at the door, her face flushed from playing outside. "You missed the snowman," she cried. "Ranger helped with the nose." The dog wagged proudly as if confirming his contribution. Ethan laughed, brushing snow from her hair. "I'll see it in the morning." Inside, Rachel was stirring a pot of soup on the stove. The cabin smelled of thyme and warmth. "Ranger's a good babysitter," she said softly. Ellie says he won't let her go past the fence. Ethan hung up his coat. Smart dog. He hesitated, then told her about Calvin. She listened quietly, eyes distant. People forget how easy it is to lose everything, she said finally. It happens faster than you think. Her voice held an echo of memory, of her own nights spent in a freezing shed, praying someone would stop. After dinner, they sat by the fire. Ellie colored in her sketchbook, showing Ranger his portrait, a wobbly but earnest drawing of a dog with enormous ears. Rachel watched Ethan from across the room. "You care about that man," she said softly. "The one from today." Ethan nodded slowly. "I don't know. Maybe I just recognize the look in his eyes." "The look?" "Of someone who's tired of being invisible." Rachel's hand brushed Tommy's hair as he slept. "You make people feel seen, Ethan, even when you don't mean to." Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Ethan rose cautiously. Standing outside was Martha Green, the silver-haired neighbor, bundled in her heavy coat. "Evening, Officer Cole," she said briskly, stepping in without waiting for an invitation. "Heard about your vagrant friend. Town gossip moves fast." Her sharp blue eyes softened slightly as she glanced at Rachel. "Don't worry, dear. I told them if they've got opinions, they can come shovel my driveway first." Ethan smiled. "You always did have a way with diplomacy." Martha chuckled, setting a small wrapped parcel on the table. "Brought this for Ellie, a book I found in the library sale, something about wolves and brave little girls. Figured it might suit her." Ellie's eyes lit up. "Thank you, Miss Martha." "You're welcome, Pumpkin. Read it with that fine-looking dog of yours." She patted Ranger's head, earning a contented rumble in return. When she left, the house fell quiet again. Ethan stood at the window, watching her lantern fade into the dark. Rachel joined him, her voice low. "You've built something here, you know. This—" She gestured to the cabin, the sleeping children, the steady heartbeat of normalcy. "This is what people like us never thought we'd find again." Ethan met her gaze, the firelight reflected in his eyes. Maybe we both just needed to stop running long enough to notice. Later that night, long after everyone had gone to bed, Ethan sat alone by the dying fire. Ranger lay beside him, chin on his paws, eyes half closed. The crackle of wood filled the silence. Ethan thought of Calvin, alone in a cell tonight, of the frost creeping into forgotten corners of the town, and of how easily one decision, a moment's mercy or neglect, could change the course of a life. He reached down and rubbed Ranger's neck. "We can't save everyone, huh, boy?" The dog gave a soft, sleepy whine, the sound halfway between agreement and comfort. Outside, wind whispered through the pines, bending them gently, but never breaking them. And for the first time, Ethan realized that maybe strength wasn't about standing alone. It was about learning to stand together when the cold comes. By late March, the snow in Maple Hollow had thinned to patches of frost that clung stubbornly to the shade. The lake shimmered with thawing reflections, and birds had begun to return, hesitant, as if testing whether the world was safe again. Inside Ethan's cabin, the rhythms of daily life had taken on a gentle cadence. Rachel hummed softly while folding laundry, Ellie helped sweep the porch, and Ranger kept his quiet vigil by the doorway. The cabin smelled of cedar and bread, homemade, slightly uneven, but warm. That morning, Ethan was repairing the porch railing when a dark sedan pulled up the dirt road. It wasn't a local car. He straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans, and watched as a woman stepped out. She was in her late 30s, neatly dressed in a gray wool coat and gloves that looked too fine for mountain air. Her hair, pale blonde and clipped short, framed a sharp, composed face. "Officer Cole," she called. Her tone was polite, practiced, professional warmth that didn't invite warmth in return. Ethan nodded slowly. "That's me." "Cynthia Ward," she said, showing her ID. "State Social Services. I'm here regarding the Carter family." Rachel appeared at the door, her hands still clutching a towel. Her shoulders stiffened instinctively, eyes flicking toward Ellie, who was now frozen on the porch steps. The air seemed to thicken. Ethan gestured toward the cabin. "Come in." Inside, Cynthia removed her gloves, placing them neatly on the table. She scanned the room with the quiet efficiency of someone trained to read entire lives in small details. The toys stacked in a crate by the wall, the smell of soup on the stove, the way the curtains were drawn halfway to let in just enough light. Ranger, sensing tension, sat up beside Ellie, tail motionless but gaze steady. Cynthia noticed. "Beautiful dog," she said. "German Shepherd, right?" "Ranger," Ellie said softly, her voice hesitant. "He's a good boy." Cynthia smiled, but her eyes were assessing. "I'm sure he is." She turned to Rachel. "Mrs. Carter, I understand you've been recovering here for several weeks under Officer Cole's care?" Rachel nodded, her hands twisting in her lap. "Yes, ma'am, he's been helping us." "And before that?" Cynthia asked, flipping open her folder. "You were living behind Jensen's tire shop?" Rachel flushed, glancing at Ethan. "Yes, we lost our home. I was sick. My daughter tried to help." Her voice trembled but held firm. "If Ethan hadn't stopped that day, I don't know if we'd still be alive." Cynthia scribbled something on her clipboard, the sound of pen on paper, sharp in the quiet room. "I don't doubt his intentions," she said, "but you understand, my job is to ensure the children's welfare is handled through official channels. Extended stays without state approval can complicate custody review." Ethan's jaw tightened. "They're safe here." "I'm not questioning that," Cynthia replied evenly. "But legality and safety are two different things." The words lingered like frost. Rachel's knuckles whitened against the towel in her hands. Ellie, small and tense, whispered, "We don't want to leave." Cynthia's expression softened a fraction. "No one's taking you away today, sweetheart. I'm just doing my job." To her credit, Cynthia wasn't cruel, just cautious. But her measured tone carried the weight of bureaucracy, and Ethan knew how easily compassion could be buried beneath protocol. He'd seen it before in other cases, other reports, families fragmented by forms and signatures. "Can I see where the children sleep?" Cynthia asked. Rachel nodded faintly and led her to the small bedroom. The walls were decorated with Ellie's drawings, Ranger under a rainbow, Ethan beside the lake, a house with 4 stick figures holding hands. Cynthia paused, eyes lingering on one particular drawing. It showed a woman lying in bed with a baby beside her, while a tall man stood by the window holding a star. Beneath it, in crooked letters, Ellie had written, "The man who found us." When they returned to the living room, Cynthia's demeanor had shifted slightly. She took a breath, glancing at Ethan. "You've done more for them than most would, but I still need to submit a report, a home evaluation, maybe temporary guardianship renewal. Expect a follow-up visit next week." "Of course," Ethan said quietly. "Do what you need to." As Cynthia prepared to leave, Ellie slipped off the couch and approached her. She held out a small paper crane, one of her many crafts from afternoons by the fire. "You can have it," she said shyly. Cynthia blinked, clearly not expecting kindness. She knelt slightly. "Thank you, Ellie. He's beautiful." "It's a she," Ellie corrected earnestly. "Her name's Hope." When the car disappeared down the road, Rachel sank into a chair, exhausted. "They're going to take them, aren't they?" she whispered. Ethan shook his head. "Not if I can help it." He crouched beside her, his hand resting gently on hers. "You've built something real here, Rachel. I'll make sure they see that." That evening, silence settled heavy over the cabin. Even Ranger seemed subdued, lying close to Ellie's feet as she colored in near darkness. The fire crackled, casting long, slow shadows across the walls. Later, after Rachel put the children to bed, Ethan stepped outside. The air was crisp and cold, the stars piercingly bright. Ranger followed, sitting beside him on the porch. "What do you think, boy?" Ethan murmured. "We've come this far. We can't lose them now." Ranger gave a low, approving rumble, his eyes reflecting the moonlight like embers. Suddenly, headlights appeared on the distant road, then vanished. Ethan frowned. "Late visitors?" he muttered. But the road remained empty, the sound fading into the woods. Still, unease prickled at the edges of his mind. Inside, Rachel stood at the window, watching him. Her hand rested against the glass, her reflection ghostly in the firelight. She whispered, "You can't fight everything alone, Ethan." The next morning brought an unexpected knock at the door. Not Cynthia, but Pastor Alan Brooks, a local clergyman in his early 50s. He was a tall man with a soft-spoken demeanor, gray hair curling at the edges of his collar, and eyes that carried the warmth of someone who had seen both suffering and grace. "Heard you've got new faces in the valley," he said kindly. "Thought I'd drop off some food from the church pantry." Rachel greeted him shyly, and he smiled. "We don't ask questions here, dear. We just make sure people eat." His presence filled the room like morning light, steady and unpretentious. Ethan, though cautious with strangers, found himself easing. Pastor Brooks glanced at the children's drawings, then back at him. "You've done something good here, officer. Don't let paperwork convince you otherwise." That night, as the family shared the bread the pastor had brought, laughter returned to the cabin. Ellie told Ranger stories about brave paper cranes. Rachel smiled for the first time in days, and Ethan, though silent, felt the invisible weight on his chest lighten just a little. For the first time since Cynthia's visit, the quiet didn't feel fragile. It felt alive. The first spring storm came without warning. One afternoon, the sky over Maple Hollow turned an iron gray, and by dusk, the wind had risen to a howl. Trees bent under the pressure, the lake whipped into restless waves that slapped against the rocks. Inside Ethan's cabin, the fire crackled hard against the wind's assault. The family had grown used to the soft rhythms of the thaw, so the sudden ferocity felt like winter, clawing its way back for one last claim. Ethan checked the window latches while Rachel secured a towel beneath the door to block the draft. Ellie sat cross-legged near the hearth, reading the storybook Pastor Brooks had brought. Ranger lay stretched beside her, his ears flicking with each crash of thunder. "It's loud tonight," Ellie murmured. Ethan crouched beside her, his hand steady on Ranger's back. "Storms come and go," he said softly. "What matters is who you're with when they do." But beneath his calm words, Ethan felt the stirrings of unease. Cynthia Ward had not yet returned for her promised follow-up visit, and while that should have brought relief, it didn't. Her silence felt like the stillness before a wave. The official report could come any day, and if it didn't favor them, the children could be placed in foster care before he even had a chance to contest it. The storm raged through the night. Around midnight, a flash of lightning revealed movement outside, the brief outline of a car parked near the road. Ethan's instincts flared. He grabbed his coat, signaling Ranger quietly. "Stay with Ellie," Rachel whispered urgently, but he shook his head. "I won't be long." Outside, the rain lashed sideways. Ethan's flashlight beam cut through sheets of water until it caught the shape of a truck, rusted, old, but familiar. He approached carefully, hand on his holster. When the window rolled down, relief flooded through him. It was Mark Rivera. "You trying to get yourself struck by lightning?" Mark called, grinning despite the weather. His dark hair clung to his forehead, uniform soaked through. "Dispatch said power lines down on the East Ridge. Thought you'd want to know." Ethan exhaled, shaking his head. "You scared the hell out of me." "Wouldn't be the first time," Mark replied, stepping out of the truck. "Figured you'd want to check the lake road before it floods again." They inspected the area together, Ranger trailing close behind, his fur plastered with rain. When they finished, both men stood beneath the overhang of the porch, dripping and silent. "You ever think about what's next?" Mark asked suddenly. "When everything with Rachel and the kids settles?" Ethan glanced through the cabin window, where light flickered against Rachel's shadow moving inside. "No," he admitted. "I'm just trying to make sure they get to have a next." Mark nodded slowly, then hesitated. "There's talk at the precinct," he said, carefully. "Hale's under pressure. The town council's been asking questions about you, about Rachel. Cynthia's report might not be as clean as we hoped." Ethan's expression hardened. "Meaning?" "Meaning someone upstate thinks you blurred a line. Professional conduct, guardianship authority. There's a hearing next month." Ethan felt the words like a cold blow. "So it's official." "Not yet," Mark said, "but it's coming." When the storm finally eased, Ethan returned inside, drenched and silent. Rachel looked up immediately, sensing his tension. "It's not just the weather, is it?" she asked quietly. Ethan hesitated, then told her the truth. She listened without speaking, her face pale but calm. When he finished, she said, "We'll face it together. I've spent enough of my life being afraid. Not anymore." Ellie woke briefly, hearing voices. She stumbled from her bed, hair tousled, holding her stuffed rabbit. "Are we leaving again?" she asked sleepily. Ethan knelt, brushing a strand from her forehead. No, sweetheart. We're staying, no matter what. Ranger pressed close beside her, as if adding his own promise. The next morning dawned eerily quiet. Branches littered the yard, and mist hung low over the lake. As Ethan chopped wood outside, a familiar voice called out, "Pastor Brooks." He trudged up the path carrying a toolbox. "Storm tore shingles off the chapel," he said with a weary smile. "But I thought I'd check in here first." His calm presence felt like an anchor in shifting tides. Ethan poured him coffee, and the pastor studied him over the rim of his cup. "You look like a man bracing for a different kind of storm." Ethan chuckled dryly. "Paperwork and rumors." Pastor Brooks nodded knowingly. "You can't fight paper with fists, but you can fight it with truth. Sometimes that's louder." Later that afternoon, Rachel insisted on helping reattach the loose boards along the porch, despite Ethan's protests. "You're supposed to be resting," he said. She smiled, brushing sawdust from her hands. "Resting doesn't make me feel alive. Doing something does." Her resilience amazed him, how someone who had known hunger and cold could still look at the world with warmth. As they worked, a small pickup truck approached. This time it wasn't Mark or Cynthia. A man stepped out, older, late 50s, lean, his gray beard trimmed neatly. He wore a county maintenance jacket and carried a clipboard. "Afternoon," he greeted. "Name's Walter Briggs. I handle inspections for child services on behalf of the state. Just routine." Rachel froze, her hand tightening around the hammer. Ethan wiped his palms on his jeans, steadying his tone. "Cynthia said we'd hear from someone next week." "Change in schedule," Briggs said simply. "Storm damage delayed her rounds, so I was assigned." Walter Briggs was not unkind, but he had the manner of a man who lived by structure. His pale blue eyes missed nothing. The cleanliness of the kitchen, the tidy beds, the smell of soup simmering on the stove. He spoke little, scribbling notes, nodding occasionally. Ranger followed him quietly from room to room, as though judging whether the man himself was trustworthy. After an hour, Briggs closed his clipboard. "Everything looks fine," he said. "Ms. Ward's report was positive overall. She just had to confirm your guardianship compliance." Ethan blinked. "Positive?" "She recommended extended supervision rather than removal. Said the children were thriving." He gave a small smile. "You must have made an impression." Rachel exhaled sharply, the tension melting from her shoulders. "Thank you," she whispered. When Briggs left, Ethan stood at the window again, watching his truck vanish into the trees. "Maybe we got lucky," he said. "Maybe we got seen," Rachel replied. That evening, after dinner, they gathered by the fire as the sky cleared completely. The world outside was washed clean, the air sharp and new. Ellie sat curled against Ranger, coloring another picture, this one of the cabin under a shining sun, everyone smiling. Rachel played a soft melody on Ethan's old harmonica, the tune tender and hopeful. Ethan leaned back, eyes half closed, listening. For the first time in months, he felt something he couldn't name, a fragile peace that might last, if they guarded it carefully enough. Outside, the stars had returned, and though the storm had passed, its echo lingered, a reminder that even in calm, there is always something worth holding on to. Spring deepened in Maple Hollow, bringing a warmth that seeped into the soil and the soul alike. The last patches of snow vanished beneath budding trees, and the lake, once frozen in silence, shimmered again with sunlight. Ethan's cabin stood like a sentinel on its bank, its windows open for the first time in months, the scent of pine and fresh rain drifting through. Inside, laughter had become the new rhythm of the place. Ellie's voice echoed through the hall as she chased Ranger, whose tail wagged like a banner of joy. Tommy, now steady on his feet, tottered after them, squealing each time Ranger barked playfully. Rachel watched from the kitchen, her hair tied loosely back, a faded blue shirt soft against her shoulders. Her health had fully returned, and with it a quiet confidence. She no longer looked like a woman surviving. She looked like someone beginning again. Ethan stepped inside, carrying a small bundle of mail from town. "You'd think the world forgot about bills," he joked. Rachel smiled, wiping her hands on a towel. "Let's hope it keeps forgetting." Among the envelopes, one bore the official state seal. Ethan hesitated, the paper heavy between his fingers. Rachel noticed his change in expression. "Open it," she said softly. He did. The letter was brief but clear. Guardianship approved, permanent custody granted until further notice, with no objection from Child Services. Ethan read it twice before speaking. "It's official," he whispered. "You and the kids can stay. No hearings, no more reports." Rachel's eyes filled, her hand rising to her mouth. "Ethan," he shook his head, smiling through the weight in his chest. "It's where you belong." She crossed the room in 2 steps and embraced him, her arms trembling with relief. Ellie peeked from behind the couch. "Mom, why are you crying?" Rachel knelt, pulling her daughter close. "Because sometimes people cry when they're happy." The day carried a lightness that none of them had known in months. They spent the afternoon outside, cleaning the yard and fixing the old wooden swing that had hung crooked since winter. Ethan tightened the ropes while Ellie painted wildflowers along the seat's edge. Rachel sat on the steps, holding Tommy in her lap, his tiny fingers clutching the hem of her sleeve. Ranger sprawled beneath the porch, basking in the sun, his fur glinting gold. Later, they all walked down to the lake. The water was calm, the air thick with the scent of thawing earth. Ethan skipped a stone across the surface. It bounced 5 times before sinking. Ellie gasped in delight. 5! That's the record! She tried her own, but her pebble plopped instantly, sending ripples in widening rings. Rachel laughed. "Guess it's not about how many skips, honey. Just about trying again." As evening fell, the lake mirrored the sky, lavender, silver, and endless. Rachel stood beside Ethan, arms folded, watching the children chase Ranger along the shoreline. "I haven't seen them this free in years," she said quietly. "They're safe now," he replied. "That's what matters." She looked at him, her expression tender but searching. "And you? When was the last time you felt safe?" He considered that, gaze on the horizon. "Maybe right now." They lingered by the water until stars began to bloom overhead. Ellie insisted on naming the brightest one. "That one's Ranger's star," she said solemnly, "because he always finds the way home." Ethan chuckled, rubbing the dog's ear. "That's a good name." Back at the cabin, they found an unexpected visitor waiting. Mark Rivera, leaning against his patrol car, arms folded. His uniform was neat for once, the badge catching the last glow of twilight. "Didn't mean to intrude," he said, smiling. "Just came by to drop something off." He handed Ethan a small wooden box. Inside were 3 engraved tags, Ranger, Ellie, and Tommy, each with the inscription, "Home is where you're found." Ethan swallowed hard. "Mark, you didn't have to." "Yeah, I did," Mark interrupted, his grin softening. "You remind this town what it means to care. Don't let the paperwork ever make you forget that." Ellie hugged him impulsively around the waist. "You're like Uncle Mark now." Mark laughed. "I'll take it." That night, the family celebrated with a simple dinner. Rachel's soup, bread from Pastor Brooks's church pantry, and a single candle flickering in the center of the table. It wasn't grand, but it was theirs. After the meal, Pastor Brooks himself appeared, having walked from town under the starlight. "I heard the news," he said with a smile that reached his eyes. "I figured I'd say a prayer of thanks." He was still in his worn coat, edges damp with dew, his silver hair tucked under his hat. He prayed softly, words of gratitude, renewal, and hope. When he finished, even Ranger seemed calmer, his head resting on his paws. After the pastor left, Rachel sat by the fire, the children asleep in the loft. "When I met you, I thought you were just a man who happened to stop at the right moment," she said. "Now I think maybe it wasn't chance at all." Ethan leaned against the window frame, the firelight tracing the faint scar along his jaw. "Maybe not," he admitted. "Sometimes we don't find people. We're led to them." Outside, the moon climbed high, pouring its pale reflection across the lake. Ethan stepped onto the porch, Ranger padding beside him. The forest was alive with quiet, the hum of crickets, the whisper of wind through pine. He looked back at the cabin, where the light glowed warm through the windows, and felt something deep settle inside him. For years, he had lived with silence as his only companion. Now, that silence was filled with laughter, footsteps, and the steady rhythm of belonging. As he sat on the porch steps, Ellie stirred upstairs, half awake. She patted down in her nightgown, carrying her drawing book. "Couldn't sleep?" Ethan asked softly. She shook her head. "Wanted to show you something." She opened the book, revealing a new picture, this time of the cabin under a sunrise, the lake sparkling, the family together, and Ranger in the middle. Above it, in large, uneven letters, she'd written, "The day we stayed." Ethan smiled, his throat tight. "It's perfect," he whispered. "Can we hang it up tomorrow?" Ellie asked. "First thing," he promised. She leaned against him, eyes fluttering shut. Ranger curled around them both, a silent sentinel. When morning came, sunlight spilled through the windows like gold. Rachel found them still on the porch, Ethan asleep with Ellie against his shoulder, Ranger lying across their feet. She stood quietly, her heart full, and whispered a silent thank you to fate, to mercy, to whatever hand had guided them all to this place. From the lake came the faint shimmer of dawn light, scattering across the surface in ripples. It looked, for all the world, like the earth itself was breathing again. And for the first time, Ethan didn't just feel hope, he lived it. In the end, this story reminds us that miracles do not always arrive with thunder or light from the sky. Sometimes they come quietly, through a child's courage, a stranger's compassion, or the hand that chooses to help instead of turn away. It is in those moments that God works his greatest wonders, whispering hope into ordinary lives. Every act of kindness, no matter how small, is a reflection of his love moving through us. And maybe, when we open our hearts, like Ethan did, like that little girl did, we become part of his miracle too. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to remember that faith still lives in the world. Leave a comment below, tell us where you're watching from, and type Amen if you believe that God still works through people every day. May the Lord bless you, keep you warm in spirit, and fill your life with quiet miracles.